How to sew the Beach Hut Bunting by Amber Makes. Make over 3 metres of beautiful bunting. Follow me and I'll show you how to sew it. Cutting the fabric. So start by taking the panel from your kit and give it a press, and you can see it's got all the different beach huts printed on it, as well as the tabs that go on the end. So once you've pressed it all, you can then start cutting it. You will also need some lining fabric, and the details and measurements for this are all in the instructions, so you have to provide this as they're not actually in the kit. So what you need to do first is divide the beach huts. Because they need to be lined and fit across the width of a normal quilting weight fabric, we need to divide them. So you need to cut them just to the right of the 8th beach hut on both layers. So just cut, as you can see here, carefully round through the white space between them. So don't cut along the lines of the beach huts, but just cut through the fabric that's between them, just like this. You'll have an odd shaped piece, but you just need to separate them. Then cut off the bunting tabs. Put those to one side because you'll use those later. They're just used for the end of the bunting string to make it a little bit neater and add some detail. And there are 4 here, so there's enough if you want to make 2 lengths of bunting string rather than 1 long length. So just remove those from the panel and put them to one side. Now you can see that I've divided my bunting panel into 2 rows of 8, so there are 16, and then 2 rows of 3, so there are 6. So there's my first section, and this is now wide enough to fit, small enough to fit across the width of your lining fabric. And then there's the 2 rows of 3, because it's much easier to line and sew it if you do them all together rather than individually. And there's the bunting tabs. I've cut those out. I'm just going to put those to one side. The extra piece of fabric that's across the top has all the little details on. You can use that for your own makes or to decorate other items. Then cut the lining fabric out. The instructions tell you what size to cut them. You'll need one that's section 1 lining, and that's used for sewing the bigger strip, the one with the 2 rows of 8 beach huts on. And then you will need the section 2 lining, and that's the one that you use for sewing the smaller piece, which has the 2 rows of 3 beach huts. And then you'll also need to cut some strips of fabric, and that's used for the bunting string that you use to sew the beach huts on afterwards. So now you've cut everything out, so put it all together in a pile and you're ready to start sewing. Preparing the fabric. The bunting is made by sewing the beach huts while still on the panel. It's more fabric efficient and easier. So to do this, place your larger piece of lining fabric right sides up, and then put the section 1 panel, the one that's got the 8 beach huts, 2 rows of 8. Place that centrally on top so that they're right sides facing. The lining fabric is slightly bigger than the bunting panel you've cut, so it will fit, but make sure it's central. Now smooth it all out and then pin it together. So you're going to sew around the edge of these beach huts. You'll actually be sewing 1/4 inch in from the outer line. So place the pins so that they're within that 1/4 inch, either inside it or outside, and then you won't need to remove them when you're sewing. So put as many pins in as you can, place them in the beach huts, and also place some in the fabric that's between them as well, and this will keep everything steady. Obviously you can take the pins out as you're sewing, so don't worry if you've got them into the seam allowance, but I found if you place 2 or 3 pins in each hut and then some between, it just helps to keep everything steady because you're going to be sewing these together all at the same time. You can see that if you cut out each of the beach huts and put them on the lining fabric, it'd take a lot longer to do and would use more fabric. So that's why I've done it in this way. So continue to pin the whole of section 1 lining and beach hut together. And you can see that's all pinned. And then repeat that with the section 2 and the 2 rows of 3 beach huts to pin it all together, and then you're ready to start sewing. Sewing the beach huts. First of all, you need to mark the turning gap, because once these are sewn, we've got to turn the right sides out. So on one side of the beach hut, doesn't matter which one, Measure to find the centre and then mark either side of this so that you've got a 1.5 inch turning gap. Just use a pencil or an erasable pen for this and repeat it on all of the beach huts. Just do one of those long sides, but it can be the right or the left, it won't matter because you'll be closing it later. So go all around all of the beach huts and mark that 1.5 inch turning gap on all of them, and I'll do it on the section 1 and the section 2 piece. So you can see here, I've marked all the turning gaps and then I'll remember where to start and finish stitching. Now you're going to sew together within that, so 1/4 inch inside that printed outline, starting and finishing at the turning gap. So I'll show you here. So you can see how my foot is about 1/4 inch wide. So I'm lining that up with the edge of the printed outline. Starting at one end of the turning gap, just work a small reverse stitch so that this seam doesn't come along. And then sew up to the top of the roof. If any of your pins are in the way like mine, then just remove them as you go. Hopefully most of them you've put out of the way. Leave the needle down in the fabric and turn it so that you sew around the edge of this roof. Again, make sure that you are working 1/4 inch inside that printed outline. You can see it through the fabric really easily. And then pivot to go around the next part of the roof. When you get to the top of the roof, again, stop at the top. Leave the needle down in the fabric, lift the presser foot and sew down to the next edge of the roof, which is the roof overhang. Stop 1/4 inch inside of the printed outline. Sew down, again stop 1/4 inch the outline, raise your presser foot, lower it. And if you always raise and lower, leaving the needle in the fabric, then you will get a neat finish because the needle will stay in place and you just simply move the fabric round to get round to the next section. So sew down the other side, again stop 1/4 inch before the bottom, leave the needle in the fabric, lift the fabric, lower the presser foot, sew along the bottom, stop 1/4 inch before the end, pivot, raise, and then stitch to the other end of the turning gap that you've marked. You can see here, reverse stitch to secure the seam and then cut the thread, and that's one beach hut sewn. Repeat that to stitch all the beach huts in the same way on the panel, and this is what it will look like when it's finished. So I've now sewn all of the beach huts all the way around. So you now need to separate them because we're going to cut around them. So the easiest thing to do is just cut roughly around the outside of them along the white unprinted fabric. Separate all of them, it's much easier to then cut them. So now you just need to cut along those outer printed lines. You can remove the pins now. So just those outer black printed lines, cut along those. Obviously, all of your stitching is 1/4 inch inside this, so you won't cut it. So take care when you're cutting around these edges of the roof bits to make sure that you keep cutting along the line, because then this gives you your seam allowance. And then cut along to the top of the roof and down the other side and down the little roof overhang. I know it's a little bit fiddly going around these, but it does give your finished beach hut a really nice shape rather than it just having straight lines going up the side. I like the little roof overhang. Now to help the beach hut lie nice and flat, we're going to remove some fabric. So trim off the corners and then grade the seam either side. So that means cutting off the corners and then taking a little snip out of the seam allowance. Now at these edges of the roof, you need to cut across the corner and into that little bit of overhang, snip into the just up to the seam but not into it, and then cut out a little V of fabric, and that just helps to remove the bulk of fabric and also trim the seam allowance around the edge, because when you turn this right sides out you'll have a lot of fabric in those overhangs, so remove as much as you can. Trim off the top of the roof and then a little snip either side, and again on the overhang cut across the corner, trim the seam allowance, snip into that corner and then cut out a little V and snip across the corner and then remove a little bit of the seam allowance the either side of that, and that's all nicely trimmed now. So you will get a neater finish. Now what you need to do is fold all of the seam allowances over to one side, because you can't press them open, so just fold them over to one side and press, and where the turning gap is, fold that and press that over to one side on both sides, including the lining fabric side. Now turn the beach hut right sides out. So pop your finger inside and push it right up to the point of the roof, and then the beach hut will turn out really neatly. The turning gap is big enough so it comes out really easily, but small enough so that it's easy to sew shut. Now to start with, just push your fingers into all the points and corners, just to push them out as much as you can. And then you need to use a point turner, or I use the stick for my turning tool set, something that's pointed but not too sharp, to push out all the points and corners. Make sure you don't pierce the stitching, and the easiest way to do this is push the fabric onto your tool rather than your tool into the fabric. So do it very slowly and carefully and push it out so you've got some nice neat points. And because you've snipped all the fabric and removed the bulk, you'll find it much easier to get into those points. So do the point of the roof and then the overhang. Do this quite slowly and carefully, and if you just ease the fabric gently as you go, then eventually you will get those little overhangs out, because that gives it a nice little detail. Now roll the seam between your fingers and press it. Make sure it's lying right on the edge. So if you just roll the seam like this and then press it, it will be like right on the edge. Now because you've folded and pressed the turning gap under, that will naturally go under, but just double check it hasn't come out at all. Fold it back under so that the folded under edges meet, like this, and then give it a press from the wrong side. So now it's really neatly pressed all the way around. So you just need to top stitch all the way around. This will hold the turning gap closed, but it will also give a really neat finish. So you can see I've just worked very close, about 3 millimeters, 1/16 of an inch from the edge all the way around. So that's the first one that we've done, all finished and pressed nice and neatly. You can give it a little steam press if you want. Repeat that with all of the beach huts, and then I've put them all into colour order. It makes it easier when you're arranging them later. So here's all of your beach huts, all pressed, and you're now ready to make the bunting. Making the bunting string. So take all the strips of fabric that you cut for the bunting string, and we now need to join them together. You can make one long length if you want to do all the bunting, or two shorter lengths if you want to do half the beach huts on one and one on the other. So decide that beforehand. Now place two of the strips right sides facing, and just mark in the bottom corner where the top strip meets the bottom corner of the bottom strip, and then draw a diagonal line just using an erasable pen from the left hand corner to that bottom point. It's just to see where to sew, and then place them back right sides facing again, making sure all the top and the side raw edges match and pin together, and you can see that diagonal line goes from the top left to the bottom right. Then sew along the diagonal line to join them. Once you've done that, open it out and press it open. Now you've joined them together diagonally, which means it reduces bulk in the seam when you fold the bunting to make the strip once you've folded it. And it also is less visible because it goes diagonally across the piece rather than horizontally. So trim the seam allowance off to about 1/4 inch and then press it again just to make sure it's nice and flat. And I always like to turn it over to the right sides and give it a press. So that's two of the strips joined together. Repeat that to join all the strips that you want to make your full bunting string. So I've joined all of mine together all the way along. You can make the whole bunting string using all the strips and then cut it into the shorter lengths later if you prefer. Now take all the strip, and lay it on your board and fold it in half with wrong sides facing, like this, and then press it. This provides a centre crease that you'll be using in a moment to fold over to. So press it and work along the whole length of the bunting string to do this. I'm just going to show you one section just to save time, but do the whole bunting string length to start with. Once you've done that, you've got that nice centre crease, open it out and fold the long raw edges to meet at the centre. So this is the same way as you would make a binding or a bias binding, is you make the centre crease and then you fold the raw edges over to meet in the centre. And the centre crease just allows you to make sure this is accurate and that they both meet in the centre. And then again, do that across the whole length of the string. Once you've done that, fold it in half again, and now the long raw edges are enclosed neatly inside and you've got an evenly made string. And repeat that down the whole length, folding and pressing, so everything's neatly enclosed like this. Then top stitch along the length Not the fold bit, but the bit where you've turned everything under. And that creates a really nice, neat bunting string. And I've used the same fabric as my lining fabric, but you could use a different colour or a print or a spot or a stripe if you wanted to make it more colourful. And repeat that to make the whole string. Joining the beach huts. So to start with, take the bunting string and measure 8 inches in from the left-hand side. This is the allowance that's left to use for tying up your bunting. And obviously you can make this longer or shorter if you prefer, but I find 8 inches is about right. Now I've put my beach huts into the colour order and print order that I want them. So at that 8-inch pin mark, place the top point of the beach hut at that pin mark. So it just overlaps a little bit and the top point doesn't go beyond the top of it, but just at the top. The top stitching needs to be at the bottom of the bunting string. Now measure 6 inches to the right of where you've just pinned the top point of the last beach hut, and then take your second one and put the point of the roof at that 6-inch mark and pin it into place. And then again, measure 6 inches. Now you can obviously make this allowance bigger or smaller if you prefer. I just played around with it a bit and found that 6 inches was about right, so that there was a gap between the roof overhangs of the beach huts, but not too much of a gap. But you can experiment with that, just like I did. So put the point at that 6-inch mark and pin it into place, and then continue that all the way down the length. I decided to make 2 lengths of bunting with mine, so I've just put 11 of the beach huts on this one, and then I will make another string the same. But if you're doing all 22 beach huts, then just continue all the way along. When you get to your final beach hut, you can trim the bunting string by measuring 8 inches from the last point of the point of the last beach hut all the way along, and then just trim the string at that point, and then that's all pinned into place. So you can see I've pinned them all nice and firmly. Now you just need to sew them. So what I did is I top stitched along the top stitching already, across the top of the roof, down there, and then right across the centre. And then that holds them really securely, as you can see here. Obviously you can see the line of stitching, but if you stitch right on top of the already worked stitching, you won't be able to see it as much. And if you want to work across the top of the beach hut, you can, or you can just work across the tops of the roofs. So your bunting is all attached, and we're ready now to finish it off. Attaching the bunting tabs. So you've got 4 bunting tabs on your panel, so you need 1 at each end of the string, so you've got enough if you want to make 2. Now take the top long edge, and you need to fold it over by 1/4 of an inch to the wrong side. So if you mark and measure 1/2 an inch from the top all the way along, remember this is the top long edge, and then fold over to meet up with those marks, then you've turned it over by exactly 1/4 of an inch. So fold that over, give it a little finger press to hold, and then just to be double sure, just press it with your iron. So now that's the top long edge folded over. Now fold the whole bunting tab in half so those short ends, raw ends meet, and pin it together. Make sure when you pin it together that turned over edge at the top stays turned over on the front and the back. So match up those side raw edges and pin, and then sew together across that side raw edge. And then it will look like this, and you've got a little tube. So open it out with your finger, and then just press that seam open and flat. Now measure, see the seam is on the right hand side, just mark with the pin the fold on the left hand side, and then open out your little tube and match that seam to the left hand side and that to the fold, and that just means that the seam is now running centrally down the back, but by marking the fold with the pin it just helps. So give that a press and then pin it together along that bottom raw edge and sew it together. So you're sewing your tube at one end, it's folded over at the other end, and the seam runs centrally down the back. And then it will look like this. So you've now made a little pocket. So just snip off the corner of the bottom seam allowances. This is to just reduce the bulk. And then to stop the little bits of seam poking above the top, just clip those off. Don't cut into the stitching at all. Just if you snip off the little corner, I just find that helps to stop them sticking out. Then turn this little pocket right sides out. So if you just put your finger inside, you can just push it out like this. And then I find if I use the blunt end of my turning tool stick, that's just enough because I can't get my fingers in to push it out. So that just helps to push it out. And then use the pointed end to poke out the others. If the top edge comes unfolded, just pop it back in and then use the more pointed edge to gently go into the corners, but do it very gently or you will split the stitches. And then that just pushes out the corners. Make sure the top edge is folded under, and there's your little pocket. And it's been designed so that you've got a little image that will show from the right side, which is why you fold and sew it in a specific way. So that's one of the bunting tabs finished, and you make all of them in the same way. So all you need to do now is take the end of your bunting string, pop it inside the little pocket, make sure the string goes right to the bottom so it's nice and secure and that it's central, because the pocket's obviously bigger than the string, so make sure it's central and pin it into place. I mean, obviously you don't need to make these little tabs, but it does make a nice finish. And then just top stitch around all four sides. That will hold the bunting end neatly into place. So there's one end of the bunting string, just with a really neat little finish. And then once you've made another bunting tab, sew that to the other end of the bunting string. So you can see with this one, I've got the little anchor picture on the outside. And because I made 2 lengths of bunting, I sewed then another little tab onto one end of the other one, and then on the other end I sewed the 4th bunting tab. Obviously if you've only made 1 length you'll only need 2 of these, but there's the other one with a little life belt on it. And your bunting is now finished, so all you need to do, flip it over because it will have got twisted, and hang it up. You can tie it to something, you can use it to decorate a room, take it on holiday with you, decorate your beach hut, or just use it to make things look summery and pretty, and your beach hut bunting is now finished.